Good morning. This is part two of the Phylum Cnidaria, and I'm just starting to talk about the different classes. Oops, there we go. It's apparently on a timer. Class Hydrozoa has a number of different organisms. Either the hydra here, this is flame coral, which isn't actually really coral at all. It's called flame coral because it looks like a flame with these white tips. When we are scuba diving, you want to really pay attention to even a slight bit of orange with white tips on whatever you're grabbing. Again, you should not be touching any of the coral or things down there, but you really don't want to touch that because it makes you feel as if you are on fire. It is unpleasant. And it is quite, well, ubiquitous everywhere. You will find it everywhere you look. It is pretty, and it is a good part of the environment, but you don't want to touch it. Also, it is not an actual coral. It's more in the hydra class, and we'll explain that. Another coral, or come on, there you go. Another hydra, I should say, is this odd one called the Portuguese man of war. Most of us can recognize something like this because it's a very odd and characteristic structure. It looks like a jellyfish, and it's sometimes mistaken for one, but it's actually a hydra. It's a number of hydras working together as a group and growing into different parts of this colony. So some of the polyp will grow into this gas-filled sail, which will allow it to be carried by air currents instead of just water currents. And then you have shorter reproductive parts that are another part of the colony. You will have the long tentacles that you usually don't get to see in here that are long and even sometimes 20 to 30 feet long that will catch prey, sting them and catch prey. And then we have these shorter tentacles that are for digestion. So you can have these mouths that will secrete enzymes, break down the fish or whatever, and then transport the food to the rest of the colony. Now, one of the key parts to understanding the hydra is that it basically stays, when I say never, it's more that it stays in a polyp cycle or part of its life cycle for most of the time. It's called alternation of generation when you have going through two or more main body stages for your life cycle. And what I mean by the alternation of generation is that these animals will stay in mostly a sessile stage. And here's the polyp. It's just in a colony and protected by this silica sheath. It's a very pretty, it looks like a glass flower, except part of it is fleshy. Basically, they live as these group of polyps catching prey and distributing the food. But sometimes they will produce and reproduce and put out something called a medusa. It's that bell-shaped part with the fringe here, referring to the Medusa of Greek mythology. Now, you can, when you have the Medusa stage, it will move around and pulse and move by currents. So it can be motile. At that point, we have sexual reproduction with egg and sperm. We have a zygote being made into a blastocyst, and then what we call a larva that moves around with cilia, and then it crashes into appropriate fertile ground, if you will, and starts growing as a polyp into these plant-like structures. Now, not all of them have this plant-like structure, but they'll at least grow a polyp, and for the vast majority of the hydras, they will live their life in the polyp stage. And this is the stage where they have asexual reproduction. So the Medusa stage is rare or fleeting, and that's the sexual reproduction, and the asexual reproduction is more of the polyp stage. Now, if we're talking about true jellyfish, we will be talking about Psychomedusae. This is a group of bell-shaped organisms, and you can actually see that they're called a bell here, where there's this curved area. And this picture is really nice because you can see the epidermis. You see that inside part of where the reproductive and actually the stomach is, and that's the gastrodermis that's inside. And then this part in between is full of mesoderm, or mesoglia, I'm sorry, mesoglia. And that mesoglia is, kind of keeps it in a curved shape. It's somewhat, maybe not rigid, but at full buoyancy in the water, it'll take this curved shape and kind of retain it. So even if there are muscles that will constrict this bell so it pushes water out of this inside part and helps the jellyfish move, when the muscles relax, it'll go back to this bell-like shape because of the rigidity of the mesoglia. Again, it's not a huge amount of rigidity, but like a plastic bowl or something, but it's enough in the buoyancy of the salt water to spring back to that shape. So it again has the nematocysts, and some of the jellyfish will actually have a very clear difference between its tentacles and these frilly parts that are its oral arms. So it has basically a main stomach for distribution of nutrients to the rest of the main body, but it has also these oral arms, so when the tentacles catch something, it can just be kind of caught up in these oral arms and digested there, and then the nutrients are brought up to the rest of the body. The reproduction of this animal is looking really similar to what I just talked about with the hydra, except it spends most of its time in its medusa stage, or its motile stage. So most of its life is in sexual reproduction and moving around in the ocean. So it's kind of the opposite of the hydra. Basically, if we start at the main hydra, the adult stage, it will release egg and sperm out into the environment, and they will have sexual reproduction. Some of the medusas will have internal, at the reproductive centers in the animal, have fertilization and then release the zygote. Either way, the fertilized egg will develop into a blastula and then this larva that's ciliated. So it's very similar to the hydra. And it'll settle or crash into a surface, usually underneath a rock or something, or overhang, and develop this thing that looks, well, out of Cthulhu horror. But it basically grows there and hunts a little bit and gets food. And the base of it starts making these weird striations, and it turns into something that looks kind of like a set of solo red cups, where they will look like they're stacked on each other. And basically these are underdeveloped or very young medusas. And the very end one in the strobila, which it's called, will break off and start pulsing. And I don't need you to know that it's ephra, but basically it develops into the medusa, the full adult stage. These are some pictures of freshwater jellyfish. That's right, we have freshwater jellyfish. They can be small and delicate or somewhat larger. But we have jellyfish blooms in the Midwest. Even in Waukesha, we've had them. There is a whole map online that keeps track of all these jellyfish blooms. And basically, it's more that they spend a lot of time in their polyp stage, shown here, where nobody pays attention. And then once in a while, even a couple decades later or 40 or 50 years later, all of a sudden, some environmental property or chemical property triggers their total emergence into the adult stage of medusa. So all of a sudden people will be diving in and find these dime-sized to silver dollar-sized jellyfish, just thousands and thousands of them in their favorite freshwater pond in the upper Midwest. So it's kind of interesting that we have that. It isn't really well understood why they show up or when they show up or why they're there, but we have them in the Midwest. And this one's really pretty. Now, here's a couple of the or the jellyfish that we know about. This is a box jellyfish. It kind of makes a square inside. And this is probably or definitely one of the most deadly to humans. Its sting causes an anaphylactic shock and will kill people. A lot of people never actually see the main jellyfish because they run into the hunting arms. There's the spotted lagoon jellyfish. It is rather beautiful. This is the classical one of the moon jellyfish, where it has this translucent glow and this shamrock shape here, where this is the gastrodermis as well as the reproductive pits that you can see here. It's very luminous, and you can see a nice bell there with the mesoglea. We can use upside down jellyfish in the lab and actually touch them. Their nematocysts don't penetrate or harm us. So it's a really good example organism. They sit in a colony literally upside down. Now, the purple striped jellyfish is shown here because it actually has purple stripes down it, even though it's orange, and you can see some nice oral arms and hunting arms. One of the jellyfish called the sea nettle actually has a light sensing organ, so it can be in the correct area for hunting. So some of these will actually have animal behaviors based on time of day, where they will stay in the depths for a while and then rise up to a certain level in the water, a significant increase in level, in order to go where the fish will be they're hunting. And then when the hunting is scarce during the night or what have you, they will come back down to a lower level where the fish may be. So they have animal behaviors, even though they don't have anything besides a very crude neural net there. Now, one of the last classes that we're going to talk about is Xanthozoa. And this has coral in it as well as sea anemones. So it's a large group. And even though they don't look the same, they are very similar. This is a beautiful, huge brain coral. And this is a big dome with living creatures, millions of them in each one of these tracks. It kind of looks like what is stylized as the top of the brain. That's why it's called brain coral. It's really part of the massive coral system, and it is fascinating and awe-inspiring to see this up close without touching it, of course. Okay, so when you look closer at the coral, it's actually a whole bunch of polyps, and they have this external skin, really, with a special tissue name that will connect to the next polyp. And these polyps, therefore, are all connected. And they also have connections underneath in the skeletal system. And they secrete this calcium carbonate, limestone, through an interesting biochemical process involving photosynthesis, and grow basically the limestone skeleton below them. So they're always getting pushed up in this skeletal system. Since this calcium carbonate will need carbon dioxide in order to function, they make that into calcium carbonate. This is a very important way that the ocean will fix carbon. And it'll fix carbon for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So this is a very important resource in carbon fixation and removing CO2 from our atmosphere. Now, you're not supposed to touch these because you can actually kill this organism, skin, and then the polyps. These polyps usually come out at night, it depends on the group, but then they have this internal gastrodermis. So, and some of them actually have, or most of them have, photosynthetic algae in them called zooxanthellae embedded in their tissues, and that's a symbiotic relationship. where the zooxanthellae will make sugars that the coral will use. And this is what we actually have when we have the bleaching of the coral. The coral isn't necessarily dead, it's just expelling all its zooxanthellae, so it loses all its color. Now, if the coral does not have its zooxanthellae for an extended period of time, even a week, it can start killing the coral. So the bleaching of the coral reefs are incredibly important, as in very, very bad. And we still don't understand why it can do that across the entire coral reef. So this coral reef is really important because it will cause sediment to fall down, and the coral will grow higher and larger, so we have this sediment. So it's actually land building, and a number of islands and even underwater mountains can be made due to long-term coral development. And here's some sponges too. So if we think about this, it covers a large amount of the seafloor proportionally, and each coral reef can actually take carbon out of the atmosphere because it's diffusing into the ocean, and take that carbon dioxide and fix it into a solid form for millennia. So this is a very important part of the carbon fixation cycle. Here is a close-up picture of reproduction in corals. These are releasing, in this case, it looks like a zygote. But many times the coral will release egg or sperm to have them fertilized out in the water. So these egg packets or zygotes will be released into the water, and usually the entire reef will be doing this at the same time, at least the same species. And this usually is at high tide, during the dark. So it's a light and a tide dependent. And it usually does this 1 to 2 times a year at the highest tide of the year. So it's a fascinating way to do this. It is not well understood how it determines this annual tide as well as the day-night cycle. These are very complicated organisms. Here's another example of a massive coral releasing, well, a massive amount of reproductive tissues. There's a nice sea star there. You can actually see this, that this archipelago, all the reef systems are releasing their eggs at the same time, shown in red here, across the entire area, or at least the same species. And so we can have the currents take these into other areas, and these eggs will settle down in the alternation of generation and start growing their own baby corals. It's a fascinating process, not well understood, and it's hard to reproduce. So we have to understand more about the corals so that we can maybe start seeding our artificial reefs for continuation of this carbon fixation. Here's a beautiful example of a elkhorn coral. This is an extremely important reef building part because it grows rather rapidly. It grows into these massive horn-like structures, and during storms, parts of this can break off and settle some other place and grow other places. So this can help start that sedimentation and actually start having other parts of coral lay down at their base and grow off of them. Now, the Caribbean has had an infectious disease in the 90s that came through and wiped out most of the elkhorn coral, about 90 to 95% of them. So we've lost a major coral reef building platform. These are endangered. It is difficult to get them, but they are a major part of reef building. And so what we're doing, or what some people are doing, is making huge artificial farms of them, growing up small bits of them called frags, and then placing them out on the reefs to help reseed the elkhorn coral. We have some cousins of this called Acropora. This is Acropora palmata, but Acropora species inside our saltwater tank, our 500-gallon one. Those are the ones that look very long and branching, and they're some of the most difficult to grow in a saltwater tank. Dr. Balza and his crack team of marine biologist students have gotten that tank into an amazing and beautiful tank because of this. Here is some finger coral, another example of it. And here's a nice colorful example of how this coral head here on the edge of a coral reef can supply and support a myriad of life. And here's some fire coral here. You can see all these different fish species, as well as some gorgons and other kind of corals and plant life can grow here. And then when a predator comes in, they can hide in the coral away from it. So this provides a lot of life and nutrient, and this would definitely be considered an environmental community to study. This is a beautiful example of a sea fan. And the sea fan has a very interesting skeleton. It doesn't have a calcium carbonate. It has a protein-based one, which makes it very flexible. It folds or fans back and forth in the water, and all these little gaps have little polyps in them to catch pieces of food that go through the fan. So this can be very important to catch, and they're vibrant and beautiful to see in the ocean. Finally, we have class Anthozoa, which is not only just with the corals, but the sea anemone. And we can see a number of really nice examples of sea anemone in our tank itself. The orange fronds of the bubble tip sea anemone are also in our predator tank with the puffer fish. They have these long fronds. They have a base that sticks to whatever substrate. Some of them can creep around and move to the side, so sometimes you'll find it in a completely different part of the tank if it is not happy where it is. Some look like stone roses and such like that, and this one looks like a strawberry. It's really odd. But basically, when you look at their structure, it looks very similar to a polyp of coral, except it's not in or secreting a coral or calcium carbonate shell. The interior, it has these almost veins in them, or like weather veins, not the other veins. And they have muscles in here to help contract and open up the oral surface to swallow whatever they catch. So these tentacles are rather long. They can sting a lot and catch things and drag them into this oral surface and put them into the gastrodermis in order to be digested. So they can grab rather large things and ingest them, and they're very active in doing this. They have longitudinal and latitudinal muscles that will help them expand and contract to pull down and bring in this organism. And it has the mesoglea in between the layers here. It has little cilia to actually move water throughout this area so it doesn't have anaerobic conditions. So it diffuses oxygen into the tissues and diffuses CO2 out. It diffuses ammonia out, as the entire group does, because they only have two tissue layers and a very thin layer exposed to the water surface, so a large amount of surface area. They release their nitrogen excreted as ammonia, and also release their reproductive cells into the water. So they use water for everything. Sea anemones also have animal behaviors. they can move about looking for the best water current, and actually some of their larvae shown here will lay down only in places that have high velocity water. High velocity water means that there's more food coming past them that they can hunt for. Some of them will actually move around and start feeling around and moving in a deliberate pattern to try to find the best place for food. And they'll actually take their food that they haven't digested and squeeze at the bottom like a toothpaste and cause peristalsis and push it on out through this movement. So they have animal behaviors, and they have reproducible behaviors that are rather fascinating, considering it does not have a brain. It has a crude neural net, and that's it. So the question is really, where is the line between nature and nurture? Again, fascinating area to look into. Thus ends the Cnidaria phylum.